This is the Christmas season. And I bet you most of the churches around today, around the world, the preachers are talking about the birth of Jesus. Now, I'm going to tell a story about Jesus this morning, but not his birth. And some people look at us strange. Why don't we have a Christmas celebration or Christmas service here at church when we gather together when it's near Christmas? Because it's just about, 4 or 5 days away. Why don't we do that? And there is a reason. Now, I have no hesitancy preaching on the birth of Christ any day of the year. I'll do it right there on Christmas Day without any hesitancy. But we don't set apart any special day as a holy day simply because that's not what was done in the New Testament. It was every first day of the week. We remember it. We gather on the first day of the week because of his resurrection. And while we're here, like we'll do this morning, we'll remember his death. But the Bible never tells us to celebrate his birthday. So what do we do about Christmas? I mean, that is a cultural day that we share with much of the world. And why would we ignore it? Well, we don't ignore it, but I want to keep these two passages in mind. And I've got them up here on the board for you out there in your cars, and you might want to turn to Romans chapter 14. And one is in verse 5. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. There's nothing in the Bible forbidding any of us to remember anything on any day. And so, but there's nothing requiring that either except the first day of the week. And so if there's something you want to do like that in any day of the year, and if it's a Christmas day that you want to remember the birth of Christ, look, be persuaded in your own mind. But it also says this, down in verse 22, hast thou faith? Have it to thyself before God. Now remember, in Romans chapter 14, the word faith is used for conviction. Do you have a conviction about what you ought to do for Christmas? There's nothing wrong with having that conviction, but have it to yourself. And so we're not going to bring the church into our personal convictions like that. And there are those that in their conviction we really ought to avoid anything that looks like Christmas because of the religious connotation it's had in the past. And there are others that will, of the conviction, say, well, look, the whole world's focused on this. We ought to take advantage of that and preach Jesus in that matter. And so those are personal convictions. Well, have it to yourself and have it before God. And let's just be very careful. Those of us that look at someone that has a different conviction on these things than we might have, and let's not judge one another on these things. It says here in this chapter, who art thou to judge another man's servant? And so let's be gracious and enjoy our holidays in our ways, and then let's also recognize that we're not going to try to bring everyone else and turn a special church service into something that may be something personal to us. We're here to honor God by doing the things He teaches us to do in His Word. And so I think it's good to remind us of that occasionally throughout the year. Now, I also want to mention this. I've got out there on the part this house to house, heart to heart. This is an issue that we mailed out from everyone from Biola to McMinnville has received this, and this is what they have received. And it starts off, the article is God's Love in 4 Dimensions. It has these two passages. Ephesians 3, 17 through 19. That Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ which passeth knowledge, that ye might be filled with all the fullness of God. And then the other text is very familiar. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Alan Webster looked at this, and you can do this with so much of the Bible. He looked at this over in Ephesians and this over with John, and he saw a relationship here. Let me just show you what he did, and it's very creative, and it's a good way to illustrate these things. We talk about the breadth of God's love. It extends to the world in breadth. Well, what about the length of God's love? Well, what length will he go to demonstrate his love for us? He gave his only begotten Son. Well, then we talk about the depth. How deep does God's love go? It goes to whosoever believeth in him, that they should not perish. And there is no sinner that is so deep in sin, but that the love of God does not reach if they would turn to him and believe and obey and come to Christ. God loves them. Well, what about the height of God's love? How high does it reach? Everlasting life. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, to just tie those two passages, they're both about the love of God and the width and the breadth and the depth and the height and the length, the love of God. So that's out there. You can take copies of that. If you don't have a copy, you ought to get one and read it, or give it to someone and let them see. There's another thing in here. There's a lot in here, but I like this one. I like this little poem that is in here, and I'll read this to you, and then I'll get to the lesson. Wow, excuse me. Here it is. Count your many blessings. Count your blessings instead of your crosses. Count your gains instead of your losses. Count your joys instead of your woes. Count your friends instead of your foes. Count your smiles instead of your tears. Count your courage instead of your fears. Count your full years instead of your lean. Count your kind deeds instead of your mean. Count your health instead of your wealth. And yes, above all, count on God instead of yourself. Isn't that good? And then there's several other articles. There's a good one in here about how to read the Bible. There's one about the marriage bed. The marriage is such perverted in our culture today. What does the Bible say about that? One about the standards. Who sets the standards? Well, just several things in this issue that if you don't have one, get it and try to get it in the hands of others. Now let's get to our sermon today. I'm not going to talk about the birth of Christ, but we're going to talk about two miracles that Christ did. He does these miracles to show us that He is the Christ. And these are the evidence. I had a poor friend once, the poor man. He said, I would believe in Jesus if it wasn't for the miracles. And I thought, how sad that is. That the very thing Jesus did to show us He was the Christ, that we might believe, He has rejected. And think about that. Who would want a Jesus without miracles? Why would someone want that? And so these miracles are given to us as the evidence that He is the Christ. But Jesus also said that I show you the Father. And when we see Jesus, we understand who God is. And this is a God that we can love. Let's look at these miracles. It's about healing the woman and raising the girl. It's told by Matthew in Matthew 9, 18 through 26, Luke in Luke 8, 41 through 56. But we're going to look at Mark chapter 5, 21 through 43. And it begins this way. And when Jesus was passed over again by ship to the other side, much people gathered unto Him, and He was nigh unto the sea. Remember the last time we talked about Christ in Mark? He'd been over there in the land of the Gadarenes, and there was that man possessed with a legion of demons. And Jesus withstood those demons. It's like a Roman army of demons is what it was, and cast them out of the man. And now he's returned back to where Capernaum was, where he had left. And the people come to him again. In fact, Mark's going to say they throng him. Much people gathered to him. And he's down by the sea, no doubt preaching again. And then one in that crowd, and behold, there cometh one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. Jairus, I'll call him Jairus. Jairus by name. A ruler of the synagogue. Well, that would raise a red flag normally. The religious people generally were very resistive toward Jesus. They didn't comprehend him. But now here's one of the rulers of the synagogue that does. The synagogues had rulers. I tell you, there was another name for those rulers. They called them the elders. The elders of the synagogues. They're kind of a prototype for what would become the elders of the churches. Well, Paul would go out and preach the gospel in all the world, and among those who would receive the gospel, among those were the Jews and Gentiles coming in, and then very soon after that he would appoint elders. How could you do that? Well, they were probably already mature men, and many of them may have been serving as elders or rulers of the synagogues. And so they were prepared then quickly to be elders in the Lord's church, because it'd be a very similar role that they were devout men that would be appointed to these things. Now here's one, and he comes to Jesus in need. It says, and the fact that he gives his name, Jairus by name. You see, these things were written at a time when you could have checked it out. And Luke may have done this. Luke went there to check these things out. He may have gone to Capernaum and said, I want to talk to Jairus. I've got his name here. And check these stories out. And by giving a name, it's kind of like, I got your name, address, email, and telephone number now. Tell me what happened, and you tell me. Is this right? And Luke checked it out and said, that, here's what it is. Now, when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and besought him greatly, saying, my little daughter lieth at the point of death. I pray thee, come and lay hands on her, that she may be healed, and she shall live. Just think of the turmoil that must have been in this father's mind as he leaves his little daughter in the last moments of her life. And instead of staying with her until she dies, he goes to see Jesus. She is at the point of death. Now, I think Luke says it this way, she lay a-dying. And Matthew says she was dead. She may have died shortly after he left her. Fathers, and especially you fathers that have had daughters, this little daughter is about 12 years of age. Do you remember that year? It's the last year of their little childhood. After 12, you're going to watch your daughters, fathers. You watch your daughters become young women. And that's such a precious year. And fathers learn that they've got to let their daughters, their little girls, grow up. But this father, he's not going to see her grow up. She lay a-dying. And he comes to Jesus. And Jesus went with him. And people followed. They thronged him. That's the word that Mark uses in verse 24. Jesus went with him, and much people followed him and thronged him. Now on the way, something happened. A certain woman had an issue of blood for 12 years. And it goes on to describe how bad this was for this woman. It says she'd suffered many things of many physicians and had spent all that she had and was none bettered, but rather grew worse. That doesn't sound too unfamiliar, doesn't it? People suffer so much. I think of Darrell. He suffered so many things. How many doctors? Many things of many physicians. What does it cost? It costs anything it is. I'm going to pay. And so she'd given all she had. And these doctors, I know, these doctors want to help. But a lot of time doctors don't know what to do. It's almost as though they add to the suffering instead of help. And for 12 years she has dealt with this. Well, it was not just a personal ailment. You read the old law, and a woman with an issue of blood was somewhat of an outcast. She was not, when that time came around, she was not to be around people. And she was not to touch people, and people weren't to touch her. And here 12 years going on, she's had this. 12 years without a hug, without that personal contact. And she's been miserable. And so she comes to Jesus. And when she had heard Jesus, she came in the press behind and touched his garment. Think of all those people that she's not supposed to be around, and she's coming up behind them, working her way through that crowd, and she reaches out and touches his clothes. And she said, if I may but touch his clothes, I shall be whole. And straightway, she touched him, and immediately the fountain of her blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the plague. Imagine how that must have felt. You know, sometimes people can feel so bad for so long that they've forgotten what it feels like to feel good. And she knew this is over. And yet, here's what happens. Jesus knew too. Now that's interesting. They touched clothes. He was in a throng of people, and no doubt people are touching him all the time and bumping into one another, but yet this was different. It says, Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned about him in the press and said, who touched my clothes? Now it wasn't that he didn't know. He knew. I'll show you. The disciples said unto him, thou seest the multitude thronging thee, and says, who touched me? I mean, people are all around him. What do you mean that somebody touched me? But Jesus knew who it was because he looked at her. Look what it says. And he looked around about to see her that had done this thing. He didn't ask who touched my clothes because he didn't know. But he's bringing attention now to what had just taken place. And the poor woman, the woman was fearing and trembling. Have I done something I shouldn't have done? I know the law tells me don't touch anyone, and now I have done it, and here it is, and I can almost see Jesus look at her, and people standing back, and now she has become, that has been the outcast. Now she's a center of attention with all eyes on her, and fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell out and told him all the truth. And look how Jesus addressed her. He said unto her, daughter, he loved her the way that Jairus loved his daughter. You see a father's love for his daughter? You know what you're seeing? You're seeing a reflection of God's love for you. That's what that is. It's a kind, gentle word that he uses. As I read this, I think of this as an older woman. And remember now, Jesus is a young man. He's about 30 years of age. And yet, he looks at her and he says, daughter, isn't that sweet? Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace and be whole of thy plague. How did her faith make her whole? Well, it wasn't that she just believed, because she believed before she touched him. It was her faith that motivated her to work through that crowd and reach out to Jesus. And that's how faith makes us whole. Faith brings us to Jesus so that we reach out for Him. So she went in peace. I'll keep going. There's more to say, and I'm going to be respectful of your time here. Now, while he yet spake, you just think about all the joy there must have been there. Why, look, a healing. The woman is healed, and she was joyful, and you know how joy picks up, but that joy must have quickly turned to sorrow when it says, while he yet spake, there came from the ruler of the synagogue's house certain which said, thy daughter is dead. Why troublest thou the master any further? The doctors may have said, that certain woman, well, it's been 12 years, your case is hopeless, but it wasn't. And now here a servant of Jairus, as we read it was a servant in another account, comes, and he must have thought it's hopeless now. She's dead. Don't trouble him any further. And how those words must have felt so heavy on the heart of that father. But Jesus comes to the rescue again. As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, be not afraid, only believe. He had believed. Now you keep your faith, because this is not over. And so Jesus suffered no man to follow him, save Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And he cometh to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and seeth the tumult, and them that wept and wailed greatly. That great multitude that followed him, he tells them, now y'all stay here. And surely out of respect for the grief of that father, they stayed back while Jesus went on alone with a very few to the man's house. And they're weeping and wailing greatly. It was the custom of those days to have mourners come in time of grief. They may not have been personally touched, but they would weep and they would wail, and the way they would express their grief would be to show the grief that is existing around there. And so the mourners had already gathered doing their job. And when he came to them, he said unto them, why make ye this ado and weep? The damsel is not dead, but sleepeth. Now Jesus knows there's a way in which death appears as asleep, doesn't it? How many times have you looked upon the dead and they're laying there like they're asleep? But there's more to that than this. Jesus is gently letting them know that this death is but temporary. He says a similar thing about Lazarus, his friend, when he dies. He says he sleepeth. And the disciples thought, well, if he sleepeth, Lord, he'll get well. And they didn't understand. And he said, no, Lazarus is dead. So he's gently letting them know that this is temporary this time. But look what happened. They laughed him to scorn. Now, our emotions are funny things. Next time you go to the funeral home, or next time we can, up around the casket where the family is gathered, it's very solemn and there's mourning there. And then out beyond the crowd and off into the hallway, you may hear off in the distance laughter. And it's a way we deal with our emotions. We go from mourning and it kind of releases that to laugh and then return to mourning again, and that's natural. But that's not what this is. This is a cruel laugh. They're laughing him to scorn. Have you ever had anybody do you that way? Well, I have. And I don't like it. It's like we sometimes say they're horse laughing him. These mourners are laughing at him and laughing him to scorn. It says, when he had put them all out, he taketh the father and the mother of the damsel, and them that were with him, and entering in where the damsel was lying, he took the damsel by the hand and said to her, Talitha cumi. which is being interpreted, damsel, I say unto thee, arise. He's not speaking some magic word. This was the Aramaic that was spoken in that region, and the little daughter, she would understand those words. Talitha cumi. And then straightway the damsel arose and walked, for she was about 12 years of age. And it says they were astonished with a great astonishment. He charged them that no man should know it. That's always seems so odd. That's such a wonderful thing. How could you not tell? Now Matthew tells that the story of this went throughout all the land, and you can imagine that. But Jesus wasn't doing this for a show. He charged them that no man should know it, and then commanded that they should give her something to eat. It's impressive to me. Maybe this is not a figment. They're not imagining this. They're astonished. But to help them see the reality of what is taking place is, well, give her something to eat. After Jesus rose from the dead, Peter would say, we knew it, and we knew it was Him, and we knew He was alive. We ate with Him. And so that giving something to eat kind of confirms the whole resurrection there, doesn't it? What a beautiful story. Let me return to the text we started with here in Ephesians 3:17 through 19, and hear these words in light of what we've just heard. That Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye being rooted and grounded in love may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and know the love of Christ which passeth knowledge, that ye might be filled with all the fullness of God. These stories we read about Jesus, they not only give us reasons to believe, they make us want to believe. Why would anyone not want to believe that Jesus is the Christ? And then if you want to believe that, you don't have to just imagine this like something that would be wonderful just because it would be nice to believe. There's reasons for faith given that we might know the love of Christ that passeth knowledge. Well, it's a beautiful story. Now, what about your faith? Your faith can make you whole. But it's not just something you have in your heart. You act on your faith. And you reach out to Jesus. And the way we reach out to Jesus for our salvation is to hear and believe and obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when we do, then once from our poor sin-sick soul, Christ does every burden roll. And we are dead to sin and alive again to live for our God. And so with that, I extend the invitation. If your faith is ready for you to reach out to Jesus, we'll be here to take your hand and bring you to Him in the waters of baptism as we stand and sing this song.